and welcome to Game and Read. I'm Erin.
And my name is Peter.
And we are here with our deep dive episode of our current pairing of Day of the Tentacle and Meddling Kids by Edgar Cantero.
There's some meddling tentacles up in this house right now, Erin. Some meddling tentacles, and they're up to no good.
That laugh you hear is Jordan.
Hi.
Jordan is our guest for this pairing. You can take a little listen to our intro episode to learn more about Jordan. We are glad you're here, Jordan. You didn't abandon us after the last recording.
I would not do that.
I mean, I thought you were going to get scared away by the specters, in our recording digital, and that, you just learn that there's somebody in a mask, and then you find out it's okay, but it's still scary, I guess. Trying to turn this into some sort of Scooby-Doo analogy, and I'm doing about as good a job as Edgar Cantero.
Oh, so the way that, if you're new here, or if you need a little reminder, the way that we do our pairings is that this episode will be a deep dive into the book and the game as individual separate medias. So we will talk about the book, we'll talk about the game, we won't be doing any comparison pairing with them quite yet, and then our next episode will be the full-on pairing, talking about them in relation to each other. We say it every time, but spoiler alert, this whole episode is going to be spoilery. We'll talk in depth about the beats and the stories and the plots and the gameplay and the whole shebang. So if you haven't played Day of the Tentacle and or read Meddling Kids and you are interested in doing that, hit pause, go do that, come back to us. We are going to start with our discussion of Meddling Kids by Edgar Cantero. Peter, can you get us started?
All right. So, Meddling Kids takes place in a vague time of the early 90s. I guess mathematically it should be 1990. And it follows the adult members of the once existing Blighton Summer Detective Club, which was a Scooby-Doo-esque gang of middle schoolers, I would say. Like, they're kind of teenagers, but it sounds like they were, 12. And they used to hang out in the summer times in this town called Blighton Hills, and they would solve mysteries a la Scooby-Doo. They had a dog companion. They would find guys who were trying to smuggle sheep, but were just hiding as big monsters with masks on. And then one summer, they solved this case that some really spooky, traumatic stuff may have happened, and they all just kind of go their separate ways and lead kind of sordid lives going into adulthood. The gang gets back together, looking into what was actually going on, that particular mystery, and they head back to, wasn't really their hometown, but where they all met each other and where they did their mystery solving to look into what it is, only to find out there's some deep, dark magic going on. There's a actual world-threatening event, hiding just underneath the surface of, this town where they spend a lot of time debunking mysteries. And they, I guess, save the world. I guess that's kind of the primer before we get into anything distinct. Jordan, is there anything you want to add to that summary there?
No, that was a great summary.
Awesome. I'm amazing at summaries. Totally off the cuff. I'm the best.
I know we all have thoughts about this book. So, Jordan, do you want to get us started? What did you think overall? What stood out to you? Why did this is part of the why are you on this pairing for Meddling Kids?
Yeah. So, let me say, and I think that I guess we'll see how much you agree with me. Had you read this before, Erin?
Yes, I read this. Oh man, a couple years ago, I think, because you told me to.
Okay. and then you read it again.
I skimmed / Wikipedia / review / Goodreads it, but basically yes, I read parts of it
That's
again.
what I did too. So I think I've read it at least once in between too. I will say though, reading it a little more apprisingly, I was a little less impressed on a reread of it than I was previously. I think mostly for the mental health stuff.
So I guess to preface that, one of the characters, Nate, who's kind of the Shaggy of this group, is that who you're talking about in particular?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Nate is, in his adult life, regularly committing himself to various mental health institutions. He has what I guess he thinks is kind of multiple personalities and or some type of schizophrenia where he sees things. At least he thinks he's seeing things.
Specific, and this is spoilery,
yeah,
right?
Everything's spoilers, so just go to town. We don't care anymore.
Okay. Specifically, the one that is most disturbing to Nate is that he sees the ghost of his friend Peter, who was the Fred of the group. So he was the good-looking, sort of everybody wanted
leader.
Charismatic, everyone wanted to date him sort of person, but due to the events of that happened previous to the book, he killed himself, and now Nate is seeing his ghost.
Yeah. So what's your updated take on kind of how they handle mental health in this particular story?
I think it's just kind of sloppy. I kind of think that they made Nate mentally ill just so they could fit in. Oh, Peter's still in this, but he's a ghost, and Nate thinks he's mentally ill because of it. And Nate has probably has mental illness too, but I felt like it seemed like that was secondary to the fact he's seeing Peter's ghost. That seems sloppy to me.
I would totally agree. I think it would have been far more interesting if Peter's ghost had shown up when they all got back together, in the 15 years later or whatever, when they're all gathered together. Or Peter's ghost was always with Nate, but Nate didn't think it was because he was schizophrenic or hallucinating or seeing things, that it was almost got to the it hinted at the supernatural element that really runs through the story, and yet it denies the supernatural element by trying to categorize it as, well, Nate is convinced that something's wrong with his brain, which is why he's seeing this thing. And I think sloppy is a good word to describe it.
Right. Well, and the tricky thing is that so Nate was committing himself to institutions before he saw specifically Peter's ghost, because Peter had only died a couple years before the events of the book, whereas Nate's kind of entire adult life he kind of spent going in and out of institutions, is how he frames it. So he clearly had some sort of mental thing going on that then eventually manifested as what he thought was visions of his dead friend, but were actually the ghost of his dead friend kind of just, lingering with him after he died. And yeah, additionally, I think it's just if I look at the dark path that Shaggy would go down in the Scooby-Doo-verse, I'm not oh yeah, that dude's totally going to be in a mental institution. I'm no, he's a slacker kind of stoner guy. He just won't amount to anything if you want to go the dark, gritty path of Shaggy in the 90s. It's yeah, he'll be a skeevy 30-something who just hangs out and sells weed or something like that.
Right, or if Nate had this history of committing himself to these mental hospitals and getting treatment, but then when Peter's ghost showed up, Nate knew it was not the same. Like I do think that there's this lack of distinction when, I mean, there's the reveal, right, that Peter it's the ghost of Peter. Nate's not hallucinating. And I just wish that Nate had been the one that's like, no, wait, this is not my mental illness. Like, yes, I have mental health challenges and like I do struggle with mental illness, but this is not part of it. And I think that would have balanced it more, and maybe not. Cheapened it maybe. Like I felt like it sort of cheapened the reveal because it's like, oh, no one thought, like everything thought and pointed to Peter being a hallucination, but just kidding, he's a ghost. Instead of giving you some breadcrumbs to be like, oh, wait, there's one character who thinks Peter is there.
Right. Well, and the thing that would have been an actual twist would have been had it been like a hallucination all along. Because going into this, it's a spooky story in some capacity. There's going to be some sort of horror element. It's like, of course it's a ghost. But like the twist would have been like, oh no, actually Nate was having a full-on mental breakdown the entire time. But I guess that would have maybe been a little too much of a bummer.
I do think that it didn't go. It is middling. Not meddling, but middling in this issue.
So moving off of that, what was, Jordan, your take on the other way they kind of adapted the gang, the Mysteries Inc. kind of pseudo gang into Meddling Kids? Obviously, it's not a 1-to-1. There's some big differences between the characters in here versus their kind of Scooby-Doo counterparts. But how do you feel about the choices Cantero made in what sort of group he set up?
I'm not entirely sure that a Weimaraner is a good stand-in for a Great Dane, but that's just me.
Much more portable, though, so like that's a much more logical dog to be carrying around.
That's maybe fair.
Like, I had to look up how big they are, and they're like, oh, that's a sizable dog, but it's not an enormous dog.
Also, I guess, let me actually look this up because I see this and it made me wonder. So Great Danes actually don't live that long. They live like 7, 8, 9 years. Weimaraners can live up to 14. So it also makes sense that they would have to switch it from a Great Dane just for the amount of time between them being teenage. But no, they don't.
It's a
because
great-grandson.
It's the grandson of the dog, so it doesn't...
Yeah, no, the dog they have as adults is a descendant of the dog they had as kids. At least we're led to believe that until the terrible twist at the end.
Yeah.
I do think Cantero...
It still could have been a great name.
I think Cantero it feels wishy-washy in that Cantero wanted to pay homage to the Scooby-Doo, to the detective stories, the Fab Five, the spookiness. And I think
Fab Five.
I read it. I don't know what it is. I think it's related to this Enid Blyton.
Oh, okay.
Author.
The
books,
Fab Five.
the Fab Five.
I thought you were referring to the Scooby-Doo gang as the Fab Five. I was like, nobody calls them that. They're Mysteries Inc.
I call them that. Just
or
kidding.
Mystery Inc.
Anyway, so I think that like you can definitely see that he wanted to pay homage to that, and he sort of was giving you this satirical mishmash of what that might look like in a gritty sort of, again, Lovecraftian weird way. Yet, I also think he doesn't go all the way. So the dog is actually a really great example, right? The dog is the allegedly the great grandson of the original dog, but it's sort of like, okay, well, I guess the group is back together, but at the end of the day, the dog is actually the spirit of
a Native American chief,
which is like, what?
The Walla Walla tribe, I believe.
What is happening? And it's like, that's not... I wish that the dog had just been the great-grandson of the dog.
Yeah, no, but instead they said, no, it's the same consciousness that it was both a dog, but also there was like a ghost of a Native American elder in there from, who wanted to stop this great evil kind of thing. And they add that only at the end. There's no hints that, the dog knows anything about anything in particular until the very end. They're like, hello, I'm actually a spirit in here. How do you do? I've been here all along. But, I mean, what else do you want to say on the dog? Because I feel like we need to jump to the other two main human characters.
No, yeah, that's what I was going to say about the dog. I just think that it took it. I think that's a really great example of drawing on the Scooby-Doo that aspect in particular, and yet I feel like he at the last minute was like, oh, this is too much actually like Scooby-Doo. I got to throw something in there that makes it different. And I think that there's a couple other places where that comes up that is just like, that was not necessary. Like that, it would have been better taking that out.
Yeah.
Which human do you want to jump to next, Peter?
Let's start with Andy. I guess she's technically the Daphne substitute, although she is such a far cry from Daphne from Scooby-Doo that she only takes on that role in that she is the second gendered female person of the group and not the nerdy one. Go Jordan.
I've been thinking about this a lot. This has been the one thing I'm thinking, because Andy is definitely the only one that can be Daphne, but it's very obviously not Daphne. No. So do you think that, I don't know, that seems weird to me. Like, all the others are obviously pastiches of the others, except Andy. Why do you think that is?
My, just guesstimation theory would be that, Cantero, either it's more of a homage to the Fab Five books, the kind of like English series of books that this is also vaguely based on that we don't know at all because we're Americans.
Okay.
Either it's somebody more like that, maybe there's a tomboy character in that or something like that that fits better with Andy, whose full name is Andrea, or Cantero is just like, Daphne sucks, let me make a character who can actually do stuff, so they get this person who's, very damaged like all of these people, but has like physical capabilities. She has some military training. She is capable of escaping from prison and doing all kinds of things because he's like, okay, if they're going to go on a big adventure, we need somebody who's physically capable because none of the other people are. That would be my best guess.
I feel like Cantero thought that Daphne, he couldn't have both he fucked with the golden boy, right? Like Fred the golden boy / Peter killed himself.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's this idea that the hot ones, Daphne and Fred, right? Like if you're going Scooby-Doo,
sure,
the hot ones can't just be the hot ones. Like they're always have the limelight. And I feel like, to me, Cantero actively eliminated Peter as a main leader because he's a ghost, and Andy is not the like hot woman who was Peter's super sidekick. Like she can't just be that stereotype. I also am, and this is me doing some fast finger Googling, in the Fab Five book series, the English book series, there is a character whose name is Georgina but goes by George.
Okay.
And she is a tomboy, and many modern readers say that she had gender dysmorphia. So I think that in this particular instance, Cantero was fully not lifting maybe, but taking a very close interpretation of the George character from the Fab Five and putting it into Meddling Kids, which I think makes sense because he is from Spain, but I also think is a little bit confusing for us as American readers who are seeing the Scooby-Doo analogies
Well,
much stronger than the Fab Five, because
that's what it's marketed as towards us, is that, you know, it's called Meddling Kids, which is a direct reference to Scooby-Doo. It's much more styled in the kind of Scooby-Doo thing. So when you throw in these things that seem wildly different from Scooby-Doo, and it's because you're doing an homage to a vaguely related but not at all related in, you know, one of the larger market mindsets, it can just be like, oh, that's confusing. But I guess it's true to his own background, because he did want to write about that some, but I guess had to temper it with enough Americanness to be able to do that. I would say, I feel like he almost sells, and Daphne is not necessarily the most well-developed character in the world. None of those characters are, because it was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, and those are notoriously only so good. Scooby-Doo's the best, and it's only so good. But Daphne did have a purpose, and her general purpose was she likes poking around at things, and so she's always the one who springs the first booby trap and is like, oh, shit, my bad, which is important in every episode. It's mostly kind of happenstance, but she's also the one who actually is just like, hey, let's go do this. And then Fred's the one who sets traps and is the leader. Shaggy's the one who's always scared and eating.
Velma's the best.
Well, Velma's the one who has information on things, so she can be like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Here's the exposition. Daphne's the one who actually gets, like, into trouble. Velma only gets into trouble when she loses her glasses because she can't see without her glasses.
I have a lot of strong identification with Velma, especially on the glasses points.
So, one thing I do want to get in with the Andy character, though, is kind of this weird thing that comes up twice in the book, and that is whether or not they directly address, is Andy possibly trans or genderqueer or something, and I don't think they handle it very well, much like the mental illness situation. Aaron, if you want to go in a little on your thoughts on how they handle Andy's kind of masculine demeanor.
Sure. So for me, I think I understand that the setting is the early 90s. And I was a very wee child in the early 90s, / non-existent if it was set in 1990. And I don't know what conversations were happening around being queer and trans. I can imagine that it wasn't talked about, right? Like it's not as prevalent as it is today. And I can imagine there were a lot of preconceived notions and critiques and criticisms and hatred and just not understanding what that means then. However, I think that the way that Andy's quote unquote tomboyishness is treated is just not. This book was written in 2017. And while I understand that the story is set in the 90s, I think that one of the jobs of an author is to take their setting and the way that we talk about certain things now in the current modern era and find this sort of middle ground, because I think it's important to acknowledge that the way that we, the collective we, as society, as culture, used to think about things and talk about things was damaging, was dangerous, was harmful. And so I think you have to find that struggle, and I personally err on the side of modern interpretation. And I think Cantero, when talking about Andy, really digs deep into how it would have been talked about in the 1990s. And I just don't think that I understand what he was trying to do, but I also think that in light of some of the other issues, such as mental illness, the native spirit of a Native American chief being part of it at the very end, more sort of transphobia, which we'll talk about as far as the ending and the villain goes. I just think in the setting of that, it wasn't handled tactfully. It was, to borrow Jordan's word, sloppy. Very, very sloppy to me. So that's my thoughts on the Andy. Oh, we thought she might be a boy.
Yeah.
We thought like
Let's
lesbian,
jump to the end there just because
like-
we're on this particular term. And Andy is attracted to women. I guess, yeah, I don't think they ever use the specific term lesbian, so I'll just say they're attracted to women and never shy away from. They never say don't say she, like they never declare pronouns or what or anything like that, but I guess yada yada yada. But at the end, the big twist is that the long living necromancer is actually in the guise of a woman, and that they had fully physically transitioned into a woman, and they kind of full on say they did it surgically. Like, because they like praise modern medicine, they don't explicitly be like, I did this and turned into that. But that was basically what was heavily implied. And then they make a weird comment. The villain makes a weird comment as to whether or not Andy should look into that in the future, which was just like, what? It was a strange thing for, like, this book chose some interesting twists. By interesting, I mean not amazing. And suddenly being like, surprise, I'm a woman because I used to be a man. And I did it just to be evil, not because this is... Like, it wasn't something they personally wanted. They were just like, oh, what's the easiest way to hide out? I know, I'll be a completely different, sex/gender.
It definitely, to me, makes light of people who are transitioning or are trans men and trans women or genderqueer in general. Like, it makes sort of sort of pokes fun, but also makes light of it like, oh, you just get the surgery. It's so easy to do it. Yeah. And then it's done. And it's like, it just, again, for a book that was published in 2017, feels just... It just feels kind of gross and icky. Jordan, do you have thoughts about Carrie?
I think of all the characters, Carrie is the one that, to me, is the one that, I guess, Carrie and Nate aren't the most memorable characters. They sort of fall behind the others, and I think Nate to me is more memorable just because of Peter, and for the fact that I felt that Nate's characterization was more sloppy, whereas I don't know, I just sort of felt like Carrie was just there because they needed a Velma.
That being said, I think that was the most accurate, depiction of one of the Scooby-Doo gangs.
Yes, and
definitely.
I totally think that's why she's not as memorable, is because
some credit.
I think that Cantero actually does a really nice job with the character of Carrie. Like, I think that, like, of all the characters, she feels maybe the most grounded. She feels like there weren't ridiculous things put on her as a character. And so she fades a little bit to the background because there are some of these... the other characters are given sort of really out there pieces about them. And she's the
only one not given a silly twist.
Exactly.
Really.
Exactly.
Yeah. Her twist is that she's Daphne and Velma put together because she has the looks of Daphne, but the brains and characterization of Velma. And also, she's the one closest with the dog, which... doesn't make any sense because everyone knows Shaggy and Scooby are best friends, not Velma and Scooby. That's ridiculous. But yeah, no, there's really not a ton to say about her other than she's kind of... Andy's got an obsession with her that I guess turns into their relationship at the end. And, Andy kind of convinces her that she's into her. And I guess you can read Carrie as being a bit more... pan, open, not just one particular attraction or the other, because she's not turned off by the idea of being with Andy, but it's it seemed like Andy had to convince her a bit and be like, oh no, you're into me, right? Yeah, maybe. And I wasn't quite sure how to read that other than I guess that's her nice romance, quote unquote, because the only other, male figure is Nate, and Nate and Carrie are cousins in the book.
Yeah. Well, and you have the whole chapter. There's a whole chapter though that's like the lead up of Carrie and uh, of them leading up to spooning. Like it's a whole chapter that's just leading up to Carrie and Andy spooning in the middle of the book, and I don't know. Whenever I think of Meddling Kids now, I think of that chapter.
Probably not what Cantero wanted you to remember.
Well, it felt a little like slash fiction.
Yeah, it felt like slash fiction of Velma and Daphne ending up together.
Slash this George character from the Fab Five.
Yeah. It just, I don't know. The fact that there's a whole chapter of like prelude to spooning is just the funniest thing to me.
Well, and really, I would personally describe the way Andy feels about Carrie, at least in the way they kind of frame her thoughts, as being not the healthiest take on the relationship. Her whole, nothing bad can happen in Carrie's room. Carrie is my shining light, even though I haven't seen her in a decade. Yada, yada, yada. I'm like, it comes off as a little creepy. It's like, there are sweet elements. They're like, oh, I kind of get the longing for a person and, not necessarily feeling like you can express that. And I understand kind of, why she would feel closed off about that. But they really are like, it felt like this kind of weird obsession with Carrie that then just at the end they're like in a nice happy relationship together. No worries. No issues with all the trauma they just went through.
I wish that the relationship between Andy and Carrie had really been that of a best friend that you haven't seen in many, many years. Because I think make Andy a boy and it's creepy. And I think a lot of people would see that as creepy, as obsessive, as unhealthy and pressuring towards Carrie. And so I feel like Cantero was like, ooh, I know what to do. I'll make a female character long romantically after another female character because that makes it more okay. And maybe he's not. Maybe he was. See, I'd be more inclined to say he was trying to point out the unhealthy behavior if they hadn't ended up in sort of a relationship thing. And to me, I'm just thinking about, like, what if Nate longed for Carrie like that?
That would be weird because they're cousins.
Well, oh my God. Fine. What if Peter, when he was alive, longed for Carrie?
He did.
Oh my God.
He asked her out. That was the whole thing. But I would say.
Okay, well, but my point is.
Okay.
My point is, if a male character was acting like that, I think it would be I would feel automatically like he does not take a hint. He does not understand no. It's a consent thing. And I think it's the same with Andy. But I don't think Cantero wanted it to be like, I don't think Cantero wrote it so that you're thinking about Andy is obsessive and Andy is trying to wear Carrie down and is not taking, like, I just think that I don't think Cantero was critiquing that when he set up that relationship.
I would say I would feel a lot less weird about the obsession thing had they had some weird fling as teens, because it just seemed like when Andy finally kind of like expresses her feelings for Carrie, it's like they kind of made it sound like Carrie hadn't really thought of it that way before. And may not be her natural inclination for that kind of stuff, where it's like maybe this would have been a stronger relationship had Carrie also had at least some inkling, or they had one thing where it was just like, oh, I remember that time. It was like, oh, that was really nice when we were kids and yada yada. And I do actually have romantic feelings for me from that time. Instead, it's like, oh, you've had this weird crush on me that I was not even randomly thinking about until you bring it up when we're both, depressed 26-year-olds, and now it's like, Yeah, okay, I'm into you now. It just felt a little out of nowhere, like a lot of things in this book, and I think it would have really helped to have some flashback. Honestly, I think there should have been one chapter that was just going through a normal adventure of theirs instead of a chapter about spooning. Maybe a chapter where it breaks down like one of their more normal mysteries before the traumatic one. That might have actually helped give a little bit more characterization to them as kids and what things were actually like before everything kind of got crappy in, the 1990s. All right, what do we want to cover next?
I mean, we haven't even touched the Lovecraftian magic
true.
stuff.
Yeah. So
let's
Jordan,
go there.
this is going to be your section. I've never done Lovecraft
right.
stuff.
All right. Pivoting away from the characters and to sort of the supernatural Lovecraftian twist.
The crux of the plot, raising an elder god.
Jordan, you're going to kick us off. What are your thoughts about the use of Lovecraft and magic and non-normal shenanigans?
Honestly, I think for a Scooby-Doo Famous Five pastiche, it was better than you'd expect. I guess I thought it was pretty good. It definitely sort of leans more towards sort of the monsters are all sort of amphibious, sort of Shadow over Innsmouth fish people kind of thing. And which I thought was effective. There was a lake. I guess the thing I liked, and this is sort of going back, is for all of my criticisms about the character of Nate and the sloppiness, I really like that Nate, of all of them, is sort of the one. All right, if this was a Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG game, Nate is the character that has like some background, some like proficiency in like occult lore. And I think that of all the characters, he's probably the best choice to have that background. I think there's a reveal about halfway through the book that there was like a spell book in the house, the De Bowen mansion.
The Necronomicon.
Yeah, and that some of the issues were caused by Nate reading it. It's also implied that might be the source of his mental illness, is him reading the book. That's a little sloppy. That's a little sketchy to me, but I do like the idea that they have at least one character who's sort of steeped in the lore, and I feel like Nate was if you're going to make a choice, Nate was probably the best choice.
I agree. I think it is a nice I love the word pivot tonight. A nice pivot that Carrie is not the one with that knowledge. I actually think it works really well to have, I agree, to have Nate be sort of the holder of the knowledge, the one who touched and tried to read the book. That aspect is to me very Shaggy-esque, right? Like sort of picking up things and just like nonchalantly opening things and shenanigans happen. And so it was a good... I think it would have been predictable if the nerdy one had been the person who is like, I know what this is. I've read about this before.
Right, and they really frame Carrie as more of a natural scientist. They specifically refer to her as a biologist, and she seems to go really far with that undergraduate degree in biology, being able to fully do vivisections of never before seen species and be like, I know how this works, which, good for her that she was able to figure that out.
He has to spend some reality here.
Yes. She has a bachelor's and is also just very smart.
I do think that overall I liked this Lovecraft element of the story, and I actually think in the grander scheme of things, the story to me is a great premise. I just think it got too steeped in the Scooby-Doo sloppiness. But the Lovecraftian stuff it gave a nice counterpoint to sort of the depressive things. It's sort of this bigger, grander, evil, maniacal stuff. However, I don't love, and this goes back to the dog and it goes back to the villain. I think that Cantero used this sort of supernatural Lovecraft magic element to sort of not write the most interesting ending. And I think to me, it comes through most in the ending where you get sort of this, it was magic, but then it wasn't magic, but then it's magic. And it's just like it and this is sort of, to me, the theme of my critique is that it wasn't a commitment in either direction. It was sort of like, we're going to give a little, but then we're going to give a little on the other side too.
Well, and it actively forgoes creating a motive for anything that happens, where they figure out, it's this necromancer who's been alive for hundreds of years. They were, they escaped Salem. They were a pirate in one of their lifetimes. They did a bunch of different things. And the reason they're trying to do this, the reason they're trying to raise Thadagoa, one of these alien elder gods kind of characters, this giant behemoth underneath the lake, is just because they want to know what happens when you do it. And it's like, okay, that's a thing. So you're basically saying you're writing this story for shits and gigs without any sort of potential, like, message or greater thinking behind it. It's all just kind of nihilistic inquiry, like, I found this book that'll show me how to, summon a weird god. Let me just try and do that and commit about 100 years of my life to trying to do that. And it just felt a little underwhelming in the end. Were this a series of things, it's like, yes, not everyone has a great motive for what they do, but maybe there should be some motive. Maybe there should be some reason that they would be like, oh yeah, let me just raise this thing that will destroy the planet. It just was dumb to me to just be like, and the villain literally just states, Deboen literally is just like, why do scientists want to split the atom? To see if they can do it. It's like, well, not entirely, because there's a lot of uses when you start splitting an atom. That does all kinds of things. It blows up. It can create nuclear energy. It could do all kinds of things. There's reasons for it. It's not just because. They were doing it for a reason. But yeah, that's my my personal critique of that. Now, Jordan, you have a bit more experience with kind of Cthulhu. I went blanking on the name. Lovecraftian stuff. Did you consider this an okay depiction of, like, Thadagoa or raising a elder god or anything like that?
I think I thought it was as good as it fitting into something Meddling Kids-ish it could be.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think they, like, starting off at the idea of a Scooby-Doo pastiche, you only have so many resources available to you to craft a good Lovecraftian story. And I think that it did about as good as it could have. I mean, there's probably some ways that I could have headcanoned it to, like, be better, like, or, like, if I was writing it, I would do differently, but that's mostly, like, hindsight is 20/20 and I'm the reader, and that's what readers do. Like, I think it would have been cool if, like, I think if I was writing it, now that he already has written it, I think it would have been cool if maybe Peter was the source of Nate's occult knowledge. I think that would have been interesting. I think that would have also, like, done more with the Peter character. But I don't know. I think for what the structure of a Scooby-Doo Famous Five pastiche allows, it was as good of a Lovecraft thing as that you could have wanted.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know a ton about Lovecraftian things, or at least I don't know about it from firsthand reading or really doing it. It's not a particular aesthetic or genre that I really seek out. But my understanding is that one of the core tenets of it is kind of like a psychological thriller to it too, where there is some like, if you are actually dealing with these kind of terrifying supernatural things, you're a bit more inclined to have insanity in that sense. And I feel like for all the time he spent kind of setting up Nate as having some insanity, he doesn't actually get to like the mind-bogglingness it would be if you're actually dealing with real life black magic and a colossal threat. And that's where I feel like he should have leaned in a little bit more onto the Lovecraftian thing outside of just like, oh, it's a big tentacle monster from outer space. But that's kind of my read on what I understand about the world of Lovecraftian, I guess, fan works at this point, because he hasn't written anything in 100 years now, a little bit less than that.
Yeah. Well,
so
and I think
yeah, go for it.
I guess the other thing I would say is where Meddling Kids loses points for me is that I don't think there are people who will, but I think that if you are going to write Lovecraftian fiction in the year 2020 or 2017, anytime in the like recent history, I think you need to write your Lovecraftian fiction in a way that it admits and sort of critiques how racist Lovecraft is. And Meddling Kids doesn't, where there is plenty of other fiction that does. And so I think, in my eyes, I think it, and it isn't even like Lovecraft is just subtly racist. He's discriminate, like obviously racist. He's very racist. And so to write Lovecraftian fiction and not critique that, and even to have, and there was even some slightly weird race things in this book too.
For sure.
With like the First Nations, Indigenous Americans stuff. It's lazy and I would say like wrong to not critique Lovecraft's racism.
Yeah, it really seems like he just wanted kind of the big monster elements, and then we'll use, you know, the perceived idea of the legends of native peoples to make a reasonable, like, oh, there's old stories about this here in Oregon from these native groups that we don't ever actually interact with or see, other than a ghost that's literally living inside a dog, and only at the very end of the book. So it's like, okay, a little racist, and then also not even helpful to the plot. So it's like, what was the point?
Yeah.
What I don't want to be entirely negative, because I gave this 2 stars, not 1 star, because I think there were possibly some good things about this, and I want to at least hit on a few things that we may have liked about the times when when you guys first read through it, or when I just kind of finished it up a couple days ago.
I guess if I might say the one positive is it's not overtly racist, which is good.
Yeah, no, it's on the low end.
It's on the low end of racism, which, like, honestly, there's still a lot of modern Lovecraft fiction out there that's still super racist. So, like, that it's because, I mean, like, Lovecraft's cosmic horror is entirely racial, right? Like,
yeah.
The giant creeping monsters is a metaphor for the fact that now Lovecraft has a black neighbor, right? Like,
yes.
So, so I guess it could have been worse.
That's the only nice thing you have to say, is that it could have been worse.
I mean, it's also, it was a fun book. Like,
Yes.
I think for the sake of like game and read, I'm being more critical than I might just be like talking about it with someone. Um,
So what are
like,
the fun elements that you particularly enjoyed in that, though? Because that's what I kind of want to draw out to get into
okay,
like the, because I didn't like hate every moment that I was listening to this on audiobook. So I do want to kind of pull out some of those. Oh, I like that bit or something like that. So what were some of those bits for you?
I think he did. I think he was very good at world building. Um, I think that for me, like, I there were some silly twists, but it never felt like I was like it never like I never it was never so bad that I all of a sudden I was like now out of focus on it and being like that's really silly. Like for the most part it's an immersive read and that immersion continued. Like there's some silly twists, but for the most part it doesn't like it never threw me off. I was always immersed in it. Um I think that one of the things I really liked about it was that and I talked about how like one of the big things for me in books and games is that spaces have to feel lived into.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me, the communities that were in the book, like the one like when they go back to their hometown and interact with people from their childhood, like that felt really authentic to me, and I think that was probably one of the stronger portions of the book, especially when they met up with that sort of old mentor figure
Captain
character.
Al.
Yeah,
Yeah, who was the former Air Force pilot question mark, but also would like ferry them around on boats and stuff when they were kids.
he felt like a Johnny Quest character
Yeah, kind of
thrown
like
into
an
the book.
old crazy Race Bannon.
Yeah, he felt like Race Bannon if Race Bannon got fired by Johnny Quest's dad and then had to
Dr.
like be a
Quest.
mentor to the Scooby Doo bunch.
Yeah. Aaron, what are some things that you liked about this book? Because when we kind of paired this together, you were not like, oh, that book is lame, but we're gonna do it anyway.
No, and I think that the overarching thing is that it's fun. I think if you're not thinking too much about it, it's a really fun story and a fun romp. And the Scooby Doo elements are this sort of like, whoo, I get that and I get that. And it's sort of just like, it's a fun story. I mean, once you start, as I reflected, I gave it 4 stars when I initially read it. Looking back, I probably would have given it a 2 or 3, which in a rate of 5, which is why I don't look back. I don't re-rate books. Anyway, that aside, it's a super fun book. I enjoyed reading it. I did. I think this. Like I said, I think the story is a really cool idea. I don't think it realizes the potential of the story. I think that there's so much more it could have been with a little more care and effort and maybe critical thinking. But that is one element. The other thing I really loved, and this gets to what Jordan has said about world building, is I thought the environment is really rich. So it's set in the Pacific Northwest. And I think that Cantero does a really great job of making you feel like you are in Oregon and you're at the banks of this lake and you see the big crumbling mansion ahead of you and you feel the fog. And I just think that his environmental descriptions are really immersive is a great word, actually. It really makes you feel like you're there, or you feel like you're like, yeah, I know what that is, even though I, Aaron, have never been to the Pacific Northwest. But I feel like I know what it's like to be in that specific place. So I thought that was a big strength. I think that there's a lot of credit there. Just that it came across as a really solid sense of place. I think that was one of the highlights and the strengths.
My favorite thing that I think this book does pretty well, if not quite well, is the feeling of returning to a place that you haven't been to since you were a child, and what that feels like and the experiences you have from doing that. And you could maybe see this as a reflection of what it feels like to revisit Scooby-Doo when you're now in your later 20s and used to watch it a lot when you were 7. And it's going to feel different, even if you don't necessarily dislike it now or anything like that. It's just going to feel like a different experience because of, one, just how you've developed, your own size, yada, yada, yada. And I think what he brings up in this book is kind of like, okay, you haven't been in this town in 13 years. The town has continued to exist without you. What is it like going back? Everything seems a lot smaller than it was. People seem a little bit sadder. Those kids that you hated are now adults that you are still going to feel animosity towards because you haven't seen them turn into normal people. You just remember them as, that jerk who used to pick on you a lot, which, they did have with Louis Krantz, something Krantz. I forget his name.
That guy.
That guy who was like, I guess, the townie kid who was always a dick to them. He pops back up, and then they learn to accept him as less of an asshole as a, guy in his later 20s. But I think that all kind of hits true, and it really reminded me of this one time where... So, Jordan, have you ever been to the House on the Rock in Wisconsin?
I have not.
Okay, don't go there.
Okay.
So it's this weird house full of oddities. It actually makes a cameo appearance in American Gods by Neil Gaiman, because it's one of like the holy places of power, because it's one of the idea of, tourist traps are actually built on places where it's kind of like people are drawn to it naturally for its relevance in the spiritualism. But it's basically this weirdo in southern Wisconsin built this enormous house that he filled with his huge collection of stuff. What did he collect? Anything and everything. And it costs like $40 to get in. It's this weird, creepy... It's not really a museum because it's not curated. Nothing is very helpful. Nothing's very informative. It's just there. And I remember going as a child, being scared of it, because it was just like, this place is creepy. It smells weird. Everything's ugly. I hate it. Can we leave? And then...
Didn't you escape out a side door? This is the story.
This was the return trip.
Oh, shit.
You're thinking of my trip to Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Oh, that's what I'm thinking of.
Where I was walking around muttering, I believe. Let me leave. I believe it. Yes, I have not returned to Ripley's Believe It or Not. But I have returned to the House on the Rock I think I was 17. So now 10 years ago, but still old enough to be like, oh, this is totally different now. And I didn't find it any more comfortable, but I wasn't scared of it. It was just kind of like, I don't get what this is. I'm not frightened by it. It's certainly smaller and less frightening feeling, but it just seems more mundane and dumb. So that is kind of what I get. They have a similar feeling of going back to Blighton Hills, where they are... expecting it all to feel like back when they were kids, and they're like, well, it doesn't quite feel that way because we're not kids anymore, and everything looks a little different, even though it's the exact same place. And while you still hold those memories and you kind of experience it looking at it again, you're just like, oh, everything's just changed now naturally. So I think Cantero really depicts that well, and I wish he had leaned into that a little bit more. And maybe, were it a bit more of an exploration of that trauma they had as a child. And you could probably still mix in some of the fun big monster stuff, but I just really think he could have leaned more heavily in with that, what he was hitting really well. Any final thoughts on the book for today?
No. Those are my thoughts.
All right, we're going to move on to Day of the Tentacle.
The second half of our pairing is Day of the Tentacle from LucasArts / Doublefine.
The remaster was done by Doublefine, and since it's a Tim Schafer game, you can basically call it a Doublefine game.
Yay! So Day of the Tentacle is a point-and-click adventure game. We played it on the computer. I think it's available on the PlayStation as well.
It's on most consoles and PC, Mac, pretty much everything.
So the story of Day of the Tentacle, we touched on it a little bit in our intro episode, but you play as a trio: Bernard, Laverne. I keep wanting to call her
Hoagie.
I keep wanting to call her Lorraine. It's not. It's Laverne. Laverne,
Wait, is it?
No, it's Laverne. You're
Okay,
correct.
yeah,
I kept wanting to call her Lorraine. Laverne, Bernard, and Hoagie. And Bernard knows Dr. Fred Edison.
I think the one in 90s times is Fred Edison.
Fred Edison is sort of a mad scientist character. He lives in this mansion, which there have been prior shenanigans with Bernard and Fred Edison. But purple tentacle, Fred Edison has made tentacles. There's green tentacle. There's purple tentacle. Purple tentacle drinks some contaminated water, turns evil, wants to take over the world. Green tentacle is this lovely, chill dude. Well, he's a tentacle who loves music and is in a band. They want to be the loudest. He's very sweet. So the game is that you try to go back in time to stop Purple Tentacle, but there's a malfunction situation, and Hoagie, Laverne, and Bernard are all stuck in different times. Bernard is the present, which is the 90s, where it's all happening. Hoagie is in the 1770s. Thank you. And Laverne is in like the far distant, probably 2,000s or 3,000s. And your goal is to figure out a way to get Laverne and Hoagie back to the present and stop Purple Tentacle from taking over the world. We talked a little bit on the intro about Peter in particular's relationship with this game. But Peter, why don't you kick us off? What are your thoughts? Sort of initial thoughts about Day of the Tentacle.
So I think it is one of the better adventure games from this time period that still plays quite well today. I think it's got a really good art style. Even if the remaster, they did a great job of making everything look very smooth, much more cartoony. Even if you're still playing the pixelated version, the characters still have a good life to them. And I think it stands out as it feels like you're playing through kind of a fun cartoon, obviously a little bit slower than a cartoon because you're moving around figuring things out, but it has the humor of it. It's got this look of it. And I think it does a good job of giving you that cartoony feeling with a mix of satisfying and sometimes bad puzzles. They run the gamut of sometimes bad to pretty fun. And when you hit those pretty fun ones, you're like, haha, that's funny, because they're all kind of like joke puzzles. But when you hit those really bad ones, they're just like, how would I know this? So that's my general view of this game. I think it holds up well and would still recommend it to people play today.
Agreed.
You do?
I do. I overall love the style and the visuals of the game. The cartoony elements, the super vivid color, the remaster. I didn't play the original, but the remaster does such a great job.
You can flip back and forth in the remaster.
Oh, can you really? Yeah. Did not figure that out. But,
yeah, I mean, I would recommend just playing the remaster. It's smoother looking. Unless you have a very deep nostalgia for the original, just play the remaster.
Yeah, the remaster just has such vivid colors, which I love. And the characters are so weird looking, and I love it. It's just like Bernard he's like nerdy boy, right? So he's got his pants pulled up under his pecs situation.
Yeah, he's a 50s Poindexter.
Yeah, and then Laverne's one eye is bigger than the other, and her hair is all over the place. And Hoagie is just like the quintessential like stoner dude.
He's a roadie, like a heavy metal roadie.
A heavy metal roadie situation. Fred Edison is like big bulbous head. The tentacles are really cartoony, but Purple Tentacle always has this eyebrow that's like makes him evil.
Yeah, it's just furrowed evil eyebrow. It makes sense.
It does. There's these really lovely wonkiness to all the characters that I just thought was so well done and made it such a fun environment to be in. Now, the puzzles.
Well, hold on. We need to get to
Oh,
Jordan's initial
fair.
thoughts.
Fair.
Before I let you rip into my childhood and eviscerate it from the inside out, I want to hear what Jordan thinks.
All right, so I am...
Jordan might eviscerate your childhood before I get to.
Your stammering speaks volumes.
Yeah, I think not playing games like this growing up, I didn't have the benefit of having any sort of nostalgia for games like this. And like the whole time, and maybe it was because like I didn't know what I was getting myself into, like I didn't do research like ahead of it.
Yeah.
So like I guess I pictured more of like Myst. I thought this was going to be a game more like Myst. It's not. So there's that. So that's on me.
In what ways did you think it was going to be more like Myst? Because both of these are adventure games, and I would say there's a distinct differences, but I'm curious, in what ways did you think it was going to be more like Myst?
I guess I felt that the way... So like Myst... I think it had a lot to do with the movement. So like my movement, I wanted movement more like Myst, whereas the movement through the rooms felt really awkward, and so I could never quite immerse myself in the game the amount. And also because it was awkward, I spent a lot of times trying to figure out how I can move through any given space.
Okay, that's fair.
So, because there are some rooms, it was a very much a 2D game, except for some rooms where it was still 2D, but it gave like an illusion of like 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And those rooms really frustrated me. And I don't know. And a lot of this is just sort of, it's just, I don't know. But I will say that Hoagie may be one of my favorite video game characters of all time.
What about Hoagie makes him so near and dear to you?
So Hoagie had me very early on in the game when Hoagie made a reference to the squirrels that like run the machines. Are they squirrels? They're squirrels,
Hamsters?
right?
Hamsters.
Yeah,
Gerbils?
Hamsters.
I think they're
Hamsters. Gerbils
Where
are
he
evil.
makes a comment about the hamster and like wanting to bite its head off, which is an Ozzy Osbourne joke.
Yeah, because he wants to do it for band practice.
Yeah, and I don't know, that joke, I like was rolling. Like,
that's one of the first gags that happens like in the intro.
I know, and it never quite like that joke. That joke had me excited, even, and then I sort of lost a lot of that excitement. But like, I don't know, that the joke endeared Hoagie to me for the length of the game.
All right.
That's so funny because I had the opposite reaction to Hoagie. I thought he was like ridiculous. Unsurprisingly, I liked Bernard the best because Peter's looking at me like
I didn't
crazy.
necessarily expect that you would like Bernard the best.
I liked Bernard because he was logical and rational, and he was
Back
smart.
to the mansion.
But I think it's so funny that just shows the difference in our taste in humor.
Well, and so part of that is I had a friend growing up, and their claim, and so one of the things that like whenever they would sort of introduce themselves, one of the things they would introduce is that they knew the person who was working in the emergency room the night Ozzy Osbourne accidentally bit a real bat.
Oh.
Because like most of the time they're all plastic and had like jelly inside of them. But one time a fan switched a real bat in instead of the fake bats that he normally used, and so he was rushed to the emergency room because he bit off the head of a real bat. And so I had a friend growing up who had a family member or something, and they always introduce, like, one of the things when they introduce themselves, they'd be like, I know the person who's who's working in the ER that night.
So you have a nostalgia for that particular joke.
Maybe not. Yeah, nostalgia, and also, like, I got it.
That's fair.
I think it's still funny where, I mean, I feel like people don't talk about Ozzy Osbourne much, so now I think it's almost more like, what's that a reference to? And then you look it up, and you're like, oh, okay. Now it's kind of like more of a fun piece of trivia, because I don't think it's as common knowledge, the whole Ozzy Osbourne bat biting thing, you know, the kind of shock rock thing of the 70s there.
I want to talk about the puzzles in Day of the Tentacle.
Okay.
Peter, you sort of already referenced that there are some really fun puzzles and there are some terrible puzzles.
Yes.
Let's start with the fun puzzles. Are they're either specific puzzles or sort of general aspects of the puzzle adventure game that you really enjoyed playing?
So what I liked most about the puzzles that stick out to me are the ones that have a lot of humor tied to them, and that's a lot of them in this game. And for the most part, the ones that are more on the humorous side, I think are pretty good. So like the like how do you get the hamster in between time periods is a fun one, with like having to you freeze him to get him to the future. Yeah,
and then you microwave him to unfreeze him.
Right. And that's funny on the one level of just like, oh, you're tormenting this poor hamster, but it's also like a reference to anybody who played the original Maniac Mansion, where you could actually microwave a hamster and blow it up.
Oh,
yeah.
Yikes.
So that is, I mean, that's a niche joke, but it's like, oh, if you're in the know, you're like, haha, they referenced it. Or even just like the talking horse, I know isn't great, but it's just kind of funny that there's a talking horse in the colonial times. Or how you deal with the Fred Edison's wife, whatever her name is, the creepy nurse lady.
Edna Edison.
Because she's in the present, she's just watching security cameras all the time, and she's like really horny too. And so you just got to find a way to like get her out of the room, and I think you end up just like knocking her chair around.
Push her down the stairs.
And I think that's a little funny.
You
in a
push
cartoon.
Her down the stairs.
It's a cartoon, and that's what you got to remember, is that like you have to solve cartoon problems with like logical cartoon solutions. And I just think that those are pretty fun. Now, the joke ones that are really bad, the one that stands out and the one that I warned you about was the how do you get it to turn into a thunderstorm. So in the colonial times, you have to make a thunderstorm happen so you can get electricity off of Ben Franklin's kite, and you don't have a way of summoning a thunderstorm out of nowhere. Except you do have a dirty wagon and a bucket of soapy water.
Dumbest thing ever.
Now, I don't know when or how this was like a joke or like what do you know, Murphy's Law kind of thing. But apparently it's funny to say, oh, as soon as you wash your car, it's going to rain the next day. I don't get it. I don't get it at all. As somebody who washes his car sometimes, I've never heard anybody bring that up in real life. But that's how you get the thunderstorm to happen. You wash a car, you wash a wagon, not even an actual car, and suddenly it's going to start raining because bad luck.
Jordan, what was your success rate with that particular piece of the game and the puzzle?
Real bad.
Did you end up looking it up?
Yep. I ended up watching lots of YouTube videos.
That one, I was glad Peter warned me. I would never have figured that out.
And I did give you an online hint system.
And I got an online hint system.
I would recommend anybody use to have fun with this game, because some of the puzzles are just going to be dumb, and that way you don't spend too much time being stuck on them.
The other one that comes to mind to me that was especially, I'll say, frustrating and out of left field is that so Bernard in the present has like a book on physics.
Yes, because he's a nerd.
He just has it. And somehow, at some point, you need the horse's teeth from the horse, but the horse only puts its teeth in the glass of water when it's asleep. So you're supposed to figure out that you have to send the textbook to Hoagie. In colonial times, Hoagie has to read the textbook to the horse, and the horse will be so bored that it'll fall asleep and put its teeth in the cup of water.
I would say that's perfectly logical in joke cartoon world. Because what's more boring than physics?
And maybe that's where I struggled, and Jordan, feel free to chime in at all if you agree or disagree. But I struggled because I think that I was looking for like actual logic when so much of it was cartoon logic.
Yeah, it was cartoon logic that wasn't necessarily grounded. So, here's like The Simpsons, all right? The Simpsons has lots of cartoon logic. But like The Simpsons for the most part is like consistent in its logic, right? Like it doesn't step outside the logic too much. It's consistent in its sort of canon logic. I'm sure there's reason to disagree with that, but for the most part, like that's how I felt.
Okay.
The part of the problem was that this game just sort of, I mean, The Simpsons, you have 30 years to start figuring out what that logic is.
Right.
This game, you just get sort of dropped into it. So you have no time. So you have no real introduction to what, like, it may have a cartoon logic underneath it, but, like, you don't have enough time to figure out that cartoon logic before you are starting to use it to solve puzzles. Does that make sense?
Totally. I mean, Peter's looking at me like, I guess so. But I think I agree.
No, it makes sense.
I
was mostly groaning at the consistent logic of The Simpsons, but
we're
there
not
are
going there.
Cartoons with more consistent logic.
Anyway, doesn't matter. No, I would totally agree. I think that and maybe this is when it was put out and that it was sort of a sequel to Maniac Mansion. But I do feel like I, as a player coming to this for the first time, I don't have any context for this game, like in the world. I'm having to get into the world from the very beginning, but then you just get thrown right in to try and solve the puzzles and figure it out. And some of them are self-evident. I think one of the aspects of this that is a strength is that there are some puzzles that the environmental clues are really good. And by environmental, I mean not just the visuals of where you are, but talking to people, particularly like you have to change the statue in the control room in present day so you can push Edna down the stairs. But the way you do that is by getting the left-hand hammer from Fred Edison in colonial times, giving it to his sons who are twin sculpturists and having
Sculptors.
Whatever. Sculptors.
Sculpturist is a fun term.
And then they switch in the left hand. It's just like that I figured out without any help because I was like, oh, I have a thing that's titled left hand hammer. And I'm talking to this character who's using his right hand. And so I think some of those environmental clues are really nice, but there's not, for me, there wasn't enough of them off the bat that I felt like I really had a handle on the kind of puzzles I would encounter in this game. So, which I think it's a mixed bag of, some of them were really great and I didn't have to look them up. And some of them, I had no idea. I looked them up and I was like, oh, I guess that makes sense in this larger world. But in this particular instance, I don't know that I would have figured that out.
I would say my favorite puzzle that is like an easy tier puzzle is how do you get that tree chopped down that Laverne is in? because I think it demonstrates several things that will help you realize what you need to do to make it through the rest of the puzzles. Because it's one of the early-ish things, certainly in kind of the first third. But there's this tree. Laverne has stuck it in the future. The tree also exists all the way in the past, in the colonial times, and you have to figure out how to get Laverne out of it. Well, you could possibly chop it down. Hey, it's a kumquat tree, so it's got lots of little orange things on it, and you can see them animated on there. And George Washington happens to be standing at a window looking out on the tree. And it requires a little bit of trivia, which I think they assume that most people would know the George Washington chopped down a cherry tree thing. And luckily, there's a can of red paint somewhere.
Well, and you can talk to George Washington, and he'll tell you all about the cherry trees.
Only chops down cherry trees. It's the only thing he'll chop down. You can be like, hey, why don't you go chop down that tree? He's like, oh, it's not the same. I only do it to cherry trees. And so I think that really sets you up for being able to figure that out completely on your own and realize, like, okay, I might need a little bit of trivia / colloquial knowledge. I might need to realize what items I can use in different spots, and I need to realize how I can affect different time periods by affecting things in, the past, basically. And I think that really sets you up for kind of understanding where a lot of their puzzles are going to come from in a relatively easy thing.
I do have to say the time travel aspect of it, that you had these 3 different time periods, was really fun. I do wish that time travel... I wish that the times had been more pertinent to stopping Purple Tentacle and like the bigger story. I think that they sort of underutilized it once they got the time machine fixed, whatever. But I love that you need vinegar.
Yes.
So you put in the colonial times. So in colonial times, you put a bottle of wine in the time capsule. And then in way future Laverne, you find the time capsule that the wine has now been turned to vinegar because it's lots of years later. And then you send it back and you have vinegar. And I love that sort of interplay between the time periods. Now, the one that I hated was the spaghetti hair for the mummy. Why? And this maybe is the cartoon logic. Like, your normal spaghetti, if you put it through the Chrono John toilet time travel loop, it turns into wet noodles with meatballs, which is hair for a mummy. Okay, that is one that, like, come on.
The meatballs doesn't make
the
any
meatballs
sense.
make 0 sense.
However, putting spaghetti in water, even if it's cold water, I think will eventually turn it limp.
Fair. But that was one...
I think. I'm not certain. Pretty sure.
That was one aspect of it. But in general, I think that time travel, switching things between times, was a really nice device to get you to think sort of outside the box of how do I solve these puzzles. Laverne needs a tentacle costume, so Betsy Ross makes her a tentacle costume. Like, it's just it adds this element of creativity, and once I realized how much you have to send things between the people, I think that I was more successful in the puzzles and solving them and getting the right materials.
Right. Moving on off of the puzzles, what was your take, both of you, on kind of the writing, the actual dialogue, the actual like written words of this game? What'd you feel about it? Did you think it was solid? Well, I want to feel you out before I just tell you what I think.
Yeah, I thought it was solid. I mean, yeah, I think it was solid. I guess the movement thing just really, like, I never was able to get fully immersed in it. I'm sorry. I don't know.
So everything
but
was hampered by whether or not you could move to certain corners of the room?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that's a thing.
It made it harder for me to get into the story when, like, it took me, like, 20 minutes to figure out one room.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, yeah, the story was good. It's just the I don't know.
Would you say that for you the storytelling and the environment, because they were out of sync, it was hard to like view them both, pay attention to both of
Yeah,
them?
it made me less pay attention and more like it was hard for me to reconcile them. Does that make sense? Like this because I struggled with moving around, it was always really hard for me to follow the story.
Okay.
I think that there were, in general, I thought that the writing and the dialogue was very clever. I think it helped you sort of get nuggets of the story and what was going on. I do think there were some aspects where you have to talk to the same person 2 or 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
And there were a few moments that it was like, you know why I'm talking to you. Like this,
let's trigger the thing now.
let's skip these funny quips and like get to the thing, because I've done these funny quips before. But overall, I liked the interaction. I think each character, Bernard, Laverne, and Hoagie, really, the writers did a great job of embodying that attitude in the dialogue of each character. Even just when you tried something that they were like, basically this object doesn't work with this other object. The way that each of them would say that was different and was specific to their sort of character. So Hoagie always would be like, I don't wanna, or like something like that. And Bernard's like, I don't think so. And Laverne, I don't remember. It was something like, oh, that's weird. I don't know. But basically, each of their reactions made sense for them as characters.
Okay.
So I think that the character development was actually really nice, and you really got that in the dialogue. Laverne in particular is a fucking weirdo.
Yeah.
And that comes across, to me, it came across really strongly in the way that she interacted with other characters, but also in just
the way
like
she walked around, like
the way she walked
just bouncing
around
her
was
arms up and
weird.
down.
The way she walked
Her
around was
big
weird.
sweater.
The way that she like commented as she did things was creepy and weird, but in a way,
And she talks like this.
but in a way that made me feel like I know who Laverne is. I don't want to hang out with Laverne, but I know who she is. So I think that's a strong aspect of this game for me, was just that character development and the commitment to those characters all the way through.
Right. Moving off of that, I did really like some of the individual characterizations of some of the folks they deal with, specifically in the past. The future, there's no real strong standout characters. You kind of get that weird, like, pet human guy. He's a little funny, but I'm about to sneeze.
Look at the light. Look at the light. Light triggers sneezes, but don't blind yourself. That's what I learned.
But what really stood out for me was the colonial period. I loved the different ways they chose to kind of frame the voices and dialogue choices of the Founding Fathers, where the main three you're really dealing with are, you got George Washington, who kind of talks like this.
He's so obnoxious.
Yeah, it's like he's super, I guess, waspy. I'm not sure what else he would be. And he's just kind of like, oh, yes, I'm George Washington. And then you got John Hancock, who is mostly defined by the fact that he's cold.
John Hancock is freezing.
Like, it's so chilly in here, but Thomas Jefferson's a piece of shit. And Thomas Jefferson sounds kind of like Sam the Eagle from the Muppets, and is just like, hello, I am Thomas Jefferson, and we are writing the Constitution to the United States. And he just, I love some of the goofy crap he gave him, where it's like he didn't want to light a fire. Well, Thomas Jefferson is like, we can't build a fire because we need to be inspired to write this Constitution, so we can't do anything like that. And I just thought the goofy characterizations of these folks, especially known people like the Founding Fathers, were really funny. I enjoyed some of the ones in the present as well. Like that one sad sack guy who just keeps trying to like kill himself, but it's with a prop gun because they're at a novelty convention.
That there's some real disturbing elements of this story.
And I love this as a 6-year-old.
I love Betsy Ross, who does not look up from her sewing machine.
She's
it's
so
like
pissed.
She's so mad, and she's like, "Ugh, just leave it on the table. I'll get there. I'll work on it. Just like leave it and go away." I just love her. She was just fantastic.
So I want to know, what was your favorite period to work in, all three of you, or all three of us? Jordan, did you have a particular period that stood out to you more than one of the others?
Colonial because of Hoagie.
Yeah, just walking around with a hoagie with his weird little like waddle.
Yeah.
All right. Aaron.
I am conflicted because there are elements of all three I really liked. I will say I thought the mansion is masterfully transformed across the three time periods.
Mm-hmm.
I love that in general, the layout is the same, but is so specific to the time period that you're in. I liked Colonial because I think those were some of the strongest puzzles and like storytelling aspects. I like the present because of the real sort of creative problem solving with the diamond, and you have to see Fred opening the safe, and you have to rescue him from the FBI, and there's some fun sort of it's not secret agent-y, but sort of like escapey aspects to that.
Right.
That one felt a little more like it's not quite a heist, but a little more like action. And then, but I also like the future because I love the tentacles. I think they're fabulous, and I think that Laverne was such a perfect character to have in the future because she is so weird that it was just so it was kind of fun prancing around the future as Tentacle Lavernticle,
holding up the front of your
tentacle dress. And the human contest is so weird and so fun and strange, and I don't know that I have a favorite time period.
Okay.
I think I liked all of them for really different reasons. And I think that's why overall for the critiques I've made, I did like this game because I felt like each environment for me was really fun to play in.
Okay. As a kid, I definitely liked Colonial the most just because I think it was the most kind of I had the best reference for it because you know a bit about the Founding Fathers, and you're like, oh, I kind of get what's going on here. It's kind of bright and sunny, and you can just there's like low threat threshold in there. As coming back as an adult, when I played this, I really like the present for a few reasons. It's so seedy and so gross. Like there's a car out front that's getting broken into by a random burglar. There's this novelty convention going on of like depressed novelty toy inventors, and it's just like this place is just such a gross motel that it just is like, yeah, Bernard just walking around like, oh look, I can use that, and it's just like depressing crap is happening all around him, and he's like, well, I gotta stop this tentacle, I guess I'll just hang out here. And going back to it in 2019 2020, it's kind of a time capsule to that era. Obviously it's a cartoon, but it kind of has a distinctive late 80s early 90s feel to it, and it's just like, yeah, that's kind of it is weirdly evocative for something that is so not set in a real reality. And so I really like it for that, where it does feel in a similar vein to even say like the Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain. The humor is kind of there, where it's very adult humor that is technically kid appropriate in that they aren't swearing or anything, but it's like, oh, a kid doesn't get why this is actually funny, but a kid is still drawn to it. And as somebody who really liked Pinky and the Brain and Animaniacs, I really appreciate kind of the vibe that it gives you of just how kind of seedy the 90s could still feel in different ways. And yeah, no, I think that was my personal favorite time period coming back to it. I think the last thing I want to mention while we're still on Day of the Tentacle is that I highly recommend going through, if you enjoyed this at all, or even just certain elements of it, I really recommend going through some of the other Tim Schafer written and directed adventure games. In particular, I played Grim Fandango for the first time 3 years ago, and I love that game so much. I need to go revisit and replay it.
Broken Age is my personal favorite.
Yes.
I love Broken Age. I think that's a fantastic adventure game.
Yeah. And I just think that Tim Schafer has a great, I mean, not always 100% amazing design. There's still puzzles, even in the most recent one, Broken Age from, 2016-ish, 2015, that aren't amazing, but it's just a good story. It's got some interesting ideas, and I think some very enjoyable puzzles. And I personally really recommend playing the Grim Fandango Remastered that you can play on anything you can play the Day of the Tentacle. It's a slightly more 3D world, and I think it's just, I love Tim Schafer adventure games so much. That's all we have for you this week. We will be back next week with our pairing discussion. We'll be taking these two things and seeing how they fit together as pieces of a whole. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Peter Hanneman. You can find me online at Nerd in the World on Twitter.
You can find me on Aaron on Twitter at Bookish Textpat and on Instagram at A Tale of Two Shelves.
And I'm Jordan. You can find me at Roaming Gnome Man on Twitter.
You can find all of our episodes, links, shenanigans at gameandread.wordpress.com.
We are on all different podcasting platforms. Please like and subscribe us, whatever else you want to do on those particular things. Our intro music is written and performed by Avery Murchison. There's a link to his Bandcamp in our episode description below.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next week.
Game and read.
After this boss fight, I'm never listening to anyone complain about Dark Souls games. This boss is so much worse.
Is this Super Bomberman R, or which Bomberman is this?
Yeah,